Hello and welcome to Who Gets Ahead, the podcast series where we talk about what we're doing to increase socio-economic diversity at senior levels in financial and professional services across the UK, and importantly, why we need to do it. I'm your host, Nik Miller. I'm Chief Executive of the Bridge Group and lead partner at More Partnership. We have a shared vision for equity of progression, where high performance is valued over fit and polish and gravitas, and over the course of this series we'll be joined by senior people from across financial and professional services, all of whom are involved with the government-commissioned Socio-Economic Diversity Taskforce, which, as many of you will know, is led by the City of London Corporation. If you want to find out more information about this important task force, you can visit cityoflondon.gov.uk/whogetsahead. Where you can also sign up to the newsletter to get regular updates. Colleagues, today on Who Gets Ahead, I'm delighted that we're joined by Catherine McGuinness. Catherine is Policy Chair at the City of London Corporation, and as many of you will know, she also chairs the Socio-Economic Diversity Taskforce. Catherine, a really warm welcome to you.
Thanks very much, Nick, and I'm really delighted to be joining this podcast today.
It's fantastic to welcome you to this podcast. Might I ask you just to tell us a bit of information about your role on the task force and maybe why on a personal level you decided to be involved?
Yes, I'm the chair of the task force, leading it along with a great strategy steering group with three co-chairs: Vincent Keaveney, our Lord Mayor, Sandra Wallace, who's a partner at DLA Piper, and Andy Haldane, who was, of course, at the Bank of England and is going to the Royal Society of Arts, but actually has an interesting role on levelling up in the meantime. I'm really pleased to be chairing this task force because I think it is an initiative whose time is absolutely now. As you said, I've been quite involved in a lot of our social mobility work along the way. I was the initial chair of that school in Hackney, seeing it from a plan on the page through to fruition, seeing what giving people opportunity could do to unlock potential. What shocks me when we look at the senior levels in financial services is that for all the work we've done on enabling access, we're not really shifting the dial yet on progression, and we're seeing that the really top roles are held by people from a narrow range of backgrounds, even though that doesn't reflect necessarily their potential.
Great, thanks, Catherine. That's a perfect segue into my next question. It's certainly our experience at the Bridge Group that there has been a sort of welcome but disproportionate focus on access and on outreach programmes. But I would like to start there, if I may, because, of course, while the focus on progression has been less concentrated, all of that work in schools and at universities is deeply important. It's what happens upstream, isn't it, before people present themselves to some of these organisations. Just share with us a bit about your experiences at the City Academy and the way in which the Academy has helped to equip young people for the journey towards professional financial services.
So I think first and foremost what the Academy did, or does indeed, is offer people a really strong foundation, a belief in themselves, a belief that they can achieve if they work hard. The tools to learn, our side of the equation is the good and solid teaching, but then showing people what doors can be open to them if they do manage to progress. When I was involved, and it was a few years ago now, when I was involved, what we would do each year with our year sevens, our new entrants, is we would sit them down and we would tell them, if you work really hard and achieve your potential, that there's no limit to what you can do. Within the constraints, of course, we've all got our own skills, we've all got our own innate ability, as well as what we managed to develop from what we're given. It seems to me that the other half of that promise to people, besides giving them the ladder, the teaching, is making sure that the opportunity actually is there and that there aren't false ceilings on what they can do.
It reminds me too that in lots of our work, people talk about a lack of aspiration among young people, and certainly our experience is it's less aspiration that's lacking and more, as you say, access to the right opportunities at the right time, whether that's mentoring or work experience or inspirational teaching. But any further reflections on what the Academy might have been doing, but also more broadly across your experience in the in the school education sector?
A huge amount of work has been done on access and on opening doors. What we would do in our schools, for example, is make sure that they have every opportunity to see what's available, whether through careers fairs, through mentoring schemes, through having people in, through indeed the academy I was involved with was set up. It was co-sponsored by KPMG, who put a huge amount into that. I think it's opening people's eyes to what the possibilities are. We have the same with culture, actually. Sometimes people feel that the arts centres and so on that we're fortunate to be involved with are not for them, that they're for other people, not for them. And getting the message across that no, these opportunities are just as much for you too, I think is part of the story. But as you say, it's no good if people get there and then can't actually progress through the levels and achieve what they're able to. And that is a real concern for me.
Yeah, I think there's certainly that matter of, is it for me? Would I fit in? And let's come back to those sorts of phrases shortly. I think also our experiences in financial and professional services particularly, there's also the question, what is it? I mean, it's interesting in our work with accountancy firms, young people, at least by the time they sort of head towards sixth form, sort of know what someone who works in tax might do or in audit. In advisory, I think that's completely opaque for lots of young people who don't, have dinner tables. They sit around talking about what some of these jobs look like. So I think, there's a sort of level one sort of mission here to raise awareness of the jobs that are available and exactly what those people do. And I know that's part of what's happened at the Academy as well.
Yes, and indeed other initiatives across the sector. So we have the Financial Services Skills Commission also looking at what we need to do to attract in the workforce of tomorrow and ensure that people also progress. It's particularly important, I think, because this has been a world-leading sector that we're lucky to host here in the UK. It does not only generate a lot of jobs in itself, but it's also a great enabler for the economy. So it's vital that we are getting a really skilled, talented workforce in.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's move now on to the piece around progression. And you mentioned in your opening comments, the time has never been more important for this. And you talked a bit about levelling up. I can't resist though gravitating towards a particular topic at this moment, which is about the pandemic. Our experience is that the effects of the pandemic have both exposed and exacerbated lots of the inequalities that we've seen. And never waste a good crisis. What positive lessons do you think on diversity and inclusion businesses have learned as we, fingers crossed, emerge from the pandemic that might be applied onwards?
Well, I think we can certainly build on the remote learning, the remote working that we've all been doing. I think that the use of technology, which has so accelerated during this time, enabling people to work from home, to work different hours. And also a slightly different mindset people seem to be developing that it's okay to work from outside the office. Hopefully, we can build on that to involve in the workforce a number of people who wouldn't have been able to join it fully if we were sticking to a 5-day, a normal, old style normal 5-day a week routine. I do worry, though, that we will see the learning loss that people have suffered really set things back. It's been fine for people who've been able to learn from home because they have the equipment. Just think of all those less advantaged students who've all been sort of clustering around one smartphone or something without the full equipment. That's going to take some time to get over. So I think there are pros and cons here.
I agree. It's interesting when lots of business leaders I was speaking to as the sort of pandemic kicked off were talking about the sort of democratizing effect of, sort of meeting online. I think individuals' experiences were very different in the workplace, just as in the school setting, as you began to describe. I think it will be interesting to see how employers can ensure inclusive approaches in a more fragmented model. When some people are in the room and some people are on the screen. It will be interesting to see what that looks like onwards, I think. Catherine, you also mentioned earlier the importance of data, and you referenced, I think, the research that we did in that respect. And I might just briefly, for the listeners on the podcast, sort of summarise what we found in that research that was published at the end of last year, and then just invite you to reflect a bit on how data is an important factor here, and then we'll turn specifically to the task force shortly. So this will be very familiar to you, Catherine, but in our research into financial services, we found that 51% of respondents at all levels from the 8 organisations were from a higher socioeconomic background as defined by parental occupation. Anyone who's listening to the podcast wondering how they should measure socioeconomic background, I will give you a link at the end of this session rather than indulge myself by talking about that in detail here. So that 51% of respondents who are from higher socioeconomic backgrounds compares with just around a third of the economy-wide working population across the UK. We found that amongst those working in senior levels in financial services, that 46% were educated at independent or selective state schools, compared with 12% of the population. But then I think, to your point earlier, Catherine, the really interesting data point was around progression. And this echoed lots of the research that we've undertaken in the legal sector, where employees from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in the financial services research were found to take on average 25% longer to progress through grades, with no evidence for differentials in performance. And just to introduce this point briefly, and I do hope we'll have time to come back to it as well, that progression gap increases to 32% when we consider those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who also identify as having a Black heritage background. So that point around intersectionality, I hope will come up. Talk to me a bit about the importance of those data points, which sounds like a very self-interested question, I recognise, and also maybe the limitations of data. What can data do for us and what can it not do for us?
So I think the data that your research found really shows that there is a problem here. In order to see what the scale of that problem is, we need to understand if that's consistent when we look at a wider, when we look more widely than the people that you surveyed. That's why we're so keen on setting a baseline by our own survey to find out the scale of the problem. But data is going to be vital in then seeing how we progress over time, seeing if we are actually able to make a difference. We've seen how that's worked, I think, with although there's a lot of work to be done, with the gender gaps that there are. This, I think, is another place where we can really both make the case that there is a problem that needs to be dealt with, look at how actually it's impacting on productivity and performance, and then look at whether, with whatever recommendations we come out with, we're actually shifting the dial over time.
Yeah, I think the publication by KPMG and then, of course, PwC followed of the pay gap by socioeconomic background, I think was a huge move forward as well. And this might gently bring us on to the point around intersectionality that I raised earlier, because in our research, of course, we found that socioeconomic background has a really significant effect on school attainment, access to the workplace, progression within the workplace, and pay. And of course, we don't want to play diversity top trumps or sort of conflate different characteristics. But I think our strong view is that socioeconomic background is a really important part of the jigsaw if any organisation wants to focus on diversity and inclusion, and that people don't experience their diversity characteristics in isolation, of course. It would be really good to hear any reflections you have on the importance or otherwise of intersectionality and how employers can sort of execute that.
Well, that's a very, very big question, Nick. I mean, I think we need to be, we really do need to be conscious of the fact that there are a number of issues here that are holding people back, that are preventing people from realising their full potential. That's a waste of talent for them, but it's a waste of talent for the sector as well, just at a time when we need to be at our most competitive. I don't think there's an easy answer other than to keep measuring and to look at whether the steps that one is taking to improve in one area are going to help across the piece. I wonder what you think about that, actually.
Well, as you say, it's a big question. I certainly think the data helps here, actually, because it really helps us understand how these characteristics intersect, and in particular, and these are not sort of judgment-based comments, I'm just observing what's in the data. When we've looked at, for example, who is successful in application processes, both at senior level and at more junior levels, we see that socioeconomic background has a stronger effect than, for example, gender or ethnic background, but that these intersections are deeply, deeply important. So when we work with an organisation and they're reflecting on why the success rate, for example, of black applicants is significantly lower compared with some other ethnic groups, for example, we find, and again, not to conflate the characteristics, but we find that socioeconomic background is a really important factor in understanding what's contributing to those differences in success rates. So I think in the data, it helps us understand what's happening and helps inform how we might then challenge it. This is a very, perhaps a sort of abstract point, but I also think it points towards organisations needing to spend as much time sort of challenging dominant cultures as they do help individual groups sort of fit in better. I think surely, lots of employees we speak to benefit hugely from, sort of fora that focus on particular diversity characteristics. I think they're essential, but I think we also need to be reflecting on dominant cultures which have been shaped historically, of course, by white men, and challenging those too. But
yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think if we challenge those dominant cultures, then hopefully that will play across two great things about being involved in this task force. First, the real enthusiasm and commitment that that has come our way from across the sector and beyond. People who really think this is important and are really keen to get involved. But I think secondly, the stories that I've heard that I wasn't expecting, people's life stories and how they've got to where they are, and how they want to see others also have the same opportunities. Just going back to your comment on dominant culture, one thing that disturbed me but didn't surprise me from your findings was the finding that people feel obliged to modify their behaviour, to act in keeping with what they think is expected.
Yeah, you'll be familiar with it, but we found that lots of the interviewees, and I should preface this by saying, there weren't lots of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds sort of presenting as feeling sort of victims. They had agency, but they often, identified that the attributes required to get ahead, those things like visibility, polish, self-promotion, confidence, which I think is a particularly interesting concept and is very contextual. Many of those characteristics are often, firstly, not related to job performance. What makes a good solicitor doesn't necessarily correlate with those things. And B, they're not neutral in relation to background. They're often more available to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think, one of our key pieces of advice to employers often is be really precise about what you mean by talent and what you don't mean, what doesn't matter. So that's been a really helpful part of the conversation. You're sort of nudging us this way already. Let's talk specifically about the task force in a second. I wanted to ask you one other question, which is sort of contextual. And we're recording this very shortly after the party conferences. And you referenced in your opening as well, the sort of levelling up agenda. And we're expecting, fingers crossed, the levelling up paper later this year. And hopefully that at least will give us greater clarity about what the government means by levelling up. But from your perspective, how does this agenda relate to what your understanding is of levelling up?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I have a precise understanding of levelling up, but to the extent one wonders who else does. But to the extent that it's about ensuring that you don't have areas of unfair underperformance, I suppose. I think we need to be looking at levelling up within places and within organisations as well as just across regions. Are there areas? I think of this particularly in the London context, where London, people think of levelling up as being focused on areas outside London. What I would say is that London has its areas of deprivation, its areas of need that we ought to be focusing on too, if we're really intent on working across the economy. But I'd also say that when it comes to looking at organisations, we should be doing the same thing. We should be looking at whether there are inappropriate disparities and discrepancies that we ought to be addressing. So I see this task force's work as fitting very much into the sort of the tone of the times.
I mean, certainly I've observed in the meetings that I've been in a sort of energy for collaboration and also for accountability. I think it feels to me that the early momentum with the task force is on the data, which I think is healthy and helpful. From your perspective, what would success look like at the end of this journey? What would you like to have seen changed as a result of the task force having come together in this way?
I'd like to see people better informed about what the scale of the problem is. I'd like to see a pathway, a plan for how we're going to address it, and then I would really like to see improvement so that over time, and we see from other initiatives that it does take time. We are changing mindsets, changing behaviour, and actually shifting things.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Who Gets Ahead, and thank you, of course, to Catherine for being with us today and sharing her thoughts. Join us next time, where Task Force members Yasmin Chinwala and Sheldon Mills will discuss intersectionality with a strong focus on visibility at senior levels. For more information on the Socio-Economic Diversity Taskforce, simply type the City of London Who Gets Ahead into your search engine to find our webpage and sign up to the newsletter to stay up to date. On social media, you can visit the City of London Corporation on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on the YouTube channel The Global City. Who Gets Ahead is produced by trading and education firm OSTC, and sincere thanks to colleagues there for their kind support for this series. You can find out more about them on Twitter and on LinkedIn.